The fall of Earth. The sky turned red on the morning the Vel'Kareth came to Earth. Nobody had expected them because humanity had only just begun to explore the stars beyond their own solar system, and they believed they were alone in the universe. They were wrong. The Vel'Kareth Dominion had ruled over 2,000 worlds across 3 galaxies for more than 10,000 years, and they had never lost a war against any species they had encountered. Their ships were massive and dark, and they blocked out the sun as they descended through the clouds over every major city on the planet. High Commander Sithrek stood on the bridge of his flagship and looked down at the blue and green world below him with nothing but boredom in his eyes. He had conquered dozens of planets before this one, and Earth seemed no different from the others. The humans had primitive weapons and limited space travel, and their governments were divided and weak. Sithrek gave his soldiers a simple order to pacify the planet within 72 hours, and then he returned to his quarters to rest. He believed the war would be over before he woke up, but when he woke up 12 hours later, his officers brought him reports that made no sense to him. The humans were not surrendering in every city and every country and every small village across the planet. The humans were fighting back with everything they had. They used guns and bombs and knives and their bare hands if nothing else was available. Sithrek watched footage of human soldiers charging directly into Vel'Kareth plasma fire without any hesitation, and he saw civilians attacking his warriors with farming tools and kitchen utensils. He saw a human woman strap explosives to her own body and run into a group of his elite guards, and she was smiling as she pressed the button that killed them all. High Commander had never seen anything like this in all his years of conquest. Other species surrendered when they saw the power of the Dominion because they understood that resistance was pointless against such overwhelming force, but the humans did not seem to care about the odds against them. They fought anyway. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, and the Vel'Kareth found themselves trapped in a war they had never anticipated. The humans refused to meet them in open battle where the superior Vel'Kareth technology would guarantee victory. Instead, they hid in tunnels and sewers and forests and mountains, and they struck without warning and then disappeared before the Vel'Kareth could respond. They poisoned water supplies and sabotaged power stations, and they used chemical weapons that the Vel'Kareth had banned thousands of years ago because they considered them too cruel. The humans did not care about cruelty. They cared about winning, and when they could not win, they cared about making the enemy pay for every single step forward. Young Vel'Kareth officer named Krath was assigned to lead a unit in the city the humans called Moscow, and he wrote letters home to his family describing what he experienced there. He told them about the cold that froze his soldiers in their armor and the humans who seemed immune to it. Told them about the underground tunnels that stretched for hundreds of kilometers beneath the city where his soldiers would enter and never return. He told them about the human children who threw stones at Vel'Kareth patrols and the old women who spat at prisoners and the men who laughed as they died. Because they had taken at least one enemy with them, Krath asked his family a question in his final letter before he was killed by a human sniper. He asked them what kind of species fights like this and what kind of madness drives them to sacrifice everything for a war they cannot win. The answer came years later when the Vel'Kareth finally understood what they were dealing with. Humans did not fight because they thought they could win. They fought because they could not accept defeat. They fought because every cell in their body rejected the idea of submission. They fought because their history was written in the blood of people who had chosen death over slavery. And they fought because somewhere deep in their hearts, they believed that even if they lost the war, they would win something more important. They would keep their dignity. They would keep their pride. They would show the universe that humanity does not kneel. The war lasted 11 years. 11 years of constant fighting across every continent and every ocean and every city on the planet. They Vel'Korath brought in reinforcements again and again, but the humans kept coming back no matter how many of them died. They trained their children to fight, and their elderly volunteered for suicide missions, and their scientists worked day and night to create new weapons and new strategies. By the time the last organized human resistance fell silent, Vel'Korath had lost more soldiers on Earth than in their previous 50 conquests. Combined High Commander Sithrak stood in the ruins of a human city, and he did not feel like a victor. He felt tired and old, and something else he could not name. Something that might have been fear. The Vel'Korath declared victory and installed a puppet government to control the remaining human population. They shipped millions of humans across the empire to serve as laborers and servants and curiosities for wealthy aristocrats who wanted to own one of the strange creatures that had caused so much trouble. Sithrak filed his final report to the Imperial Council, and he included a warning that his superiors ignored. He told them that the humans were not broken. He told them that a species that fights like this does not simply accept defeat. He told them that spreading humans across the empire might be the biggest mistake the Dominion had ever made. But the council laughed at his concerns because they had won the war, and they believed that victory meant the end of the conflict. They did not understand that for humans, the war never truly ends. It only changes form. It goes underground, it waits, and it grows across the Dominion. Human slaves looked up at alien skies, and they remembered their home, and they remembered their dead, and they made silent promises to each other. They would survive, they would learn, they would wait for the right moment, and then they would show the galaxy what humanity could really do. The fall of Earth was not the end of the human story, it was only the beginning. The seeds of rebellion. 15 years had passed since Earth fell silent, and the humans had spread like seeds carried by the wind across the vast reaches of the Vel'Korath Dominion. They worked in the deep mines of frozen worlds where they dug for precious metals that powered the Empire's ships. They served in the kitchens and bedrooms of aristocrats who treated them like pets or toys to be used and discarded. They labored in the engine rooms of massive warships where the heat was so intense that other species could not survive for more than a few hours. But humans could survive almost anything. That was what made them so valuable as slaves, and that was what would make them so dangerous as enemies. Elena Vasquez had been 17 years old when the Vel'Korath invaded Earth, and she had spent 4 years fighting in the underground resistance in South America before she was captured and shipped across the stars. Now, she was 32, and she worked in a factory on a world called Keth Prime, where millions of slaves manufactured weapons for the Dominion military. Her hands were scarred from years of hard labor, and her back was marked with the wounds from Vel'Korath whips, but her eyes still held the same fire they had held when she was a young fighter in the jungles of her homeland. She had never stopped being a soldier. She had just learned to fight a different kind of war. Elena had spent 15 years watching and listening and learning everything she could about her captors. She learned their language and their customs and their weaknesses. She learned that the Vel'Korath ruled through fear and through a strict genetic hierarchy that placed them above all other species in the galaxy. She learned that they had conquered dozens of other races before they came to Earth, and that these species had served the Dominion for so long that they had forgotten what freedom felt like. But she also learned something else, something that gave her hope. The other slaves had not forgotten how to dream. They whispered to each other in the darkness of their barracks about the old days before the Vel'Korath came. They told stories about their homeworlds and their families and the lives they had lost. And when they heard the humans talk about their own resistance on Earth, they listened with something like hunger in their eyes. Elena realized that the Vel'Korath had made a terrible mistake. They had scattered the humans across their empire, thinking that isolation would break their spirit, but instead they had planted seeds of rebellion on 1,000 different worlds, and now those seeds were beginning to grow. Elena made contact with a human named Marcus Chen, who worked in the military shipyards of the Dominion. Homeworld Marcus had been an engineer on Earth before the invasion, and he had allowed himself to be captured because he knew his skills would make him valuable to the enemy for 8 years. He had worked his way into positions of trust, and he had memorized every detail of the ships he helped maintain. He knew their systems and their codes and their vulnerabilities, and he had been waiting for someone to give him a reason to use that knowledge. Elena also found Dmitry Volkov, who had been a sergeant in the Russian army during the war on Earth. Dmitry had surrendered deliberately after the resistance collapsed because he believed the real fight would happen among the stars. He had spent 15 years rising through the ranks of the human labor battalions until the Velkhoreth trusted him to oversee thousands of his own people. They thought he was loyal. They thought he was broken. They were fools. Elena connected these scattered humans through a network of whispers and secret messages carried by slaves who moved between worlds. She taught them the same lessons she had learned in the jungles of South America. She taught them that an empire built on slavery is only as strong as the chains that hold it together. And she taught them that humans are very good at breaking chains. But Elena knew that humans alone could not bring down the dominion. They were too few, and the empire was too vast. She did something that no one had ever done before. She reached out to the other enslaved species. She found the Chitra, who were insectoid creatures with a shared mind that allowed them to communicate instantly across vast distances. She found the Morvellans, who were aquatic beings that could survive in any liquid environment and who maintained the water and cooling systems that kept Velkhoreth cities running. She found the Kronith, who were made of living stone and who were nearly impossible to kill and who had been used as shock troops by the Dominion for thousands of years. At first, the other species were afraid to listen. They had been slaves for so long that they could not imagine any other life. They told Elena that rebellion was impossible and that the Velkhoreth were too powerful and that resistance would only bring more suffering. Elena listened to their fears and she understood them. But then she told them about Earth. She told them about the 11 years of war and the millions who had died fighting for freedom. She told them about the children who had thrown stones at tanks and the old women who had hidden fighters in their homes and the soldiers who had smiled as they died. She told them that humans knew what it meant to face impossible odds and fight anyway. And she told them something that she had learned during those dark years in the tunnels beneath her homeland. She told them that the Velkhoreth were not gods. They were just another empire built on fear and lies and the belief that power makes right. And empires like that can fall. They have fallen before, they will fall again. All it takes is enough people who are willing to stand up and say no. Chitra were the first to join her network because they could feel the emotions of the humans. They worked alongside, and they recognized something they had not felt in centuries. Hope the Morvellans joined next because they remembered legends of their homeworld before the Velkhoreth came, and they wanted their children to swim in free waters again. The Kronith took longer because their minds moved slowly like the mountains they resembled, but when they finally decided to join, they did so with absolute commitment. Elena watched her network grow from a handful of desperate slaves to thousands of silent rebels spread across the Dominion. She knew that the moment was coming when they would have to act. She knew that many of them would die when that moment came. She also knew that this was what humanity had been born to do. They had lost their planet, but they had gained something more valuable. They had gained a purpose, and that purpose would shake the galaxy to its core. The seeds of rebellion had been planted. Now it was time to wait for them to bloom. The spark Marcus Chun stood alone in the central control room of the Imperial shipyard on Velkhor Prime, and he felt his heart beating so fast that he thought it might burst through his chest. 8 years of patience had led to this moment. 8 years of pretending to be a loyal slave who only wanted to serve his masters. 8 years of smiling at officers who treated him like an animal and bowing to aristocrats who could not even remember his name. All of it had been preparation for what he was About to do the date was no accident. Elena had chosen it specifically because it was the anniversary of the day Earth finally fell. Every human in the galaxy knew this date, and they carried it in their hearts like a wound that would never heal. But tonight that wound would become a weapon. Marcus looked at the console in front of him, and he entered the codes he had memorized over years of careful observation. The Vel'Korath trusted their security systems completely because no slave had ever broken them before. They did not understand that humans are very good at pretending to be harmless while they wait for the perfect moment to strike. The virus he uploaded was simple and elegant, and it did exactly what Elena had asked him to create it. Did not destroy the Imperial fleet, it freed it. Every ship and every dock across the Dominion suddenly accepted commands from anyone who knew how to give them. The genetic locks that ensured only Vel'Korath officers could control the weapons and engines simply disappeared, and then the emergency broadcast system activated on every frequency in every language spoken across the Empire. Marcus had recorded the message himself, and his voice was steady and calm as it echoed through space. The chains are broken. Rise on Keth Prime. Elena heard the message through the speakers in her factory, and she felt tears streaming down her face, but she did not have time for tears. She turned to the thousands of workers who had gathered around her, and she saw the same fire in their eyes that had burned in the hearts of the resistance fighters on Earth. They had been waiting for this moment for 15 years now. It had finally come. Elena raised her hand and gave the signal, and the rebellion on Keth Prime began. Humans moved first because they had trained for this in secret for years. They pulled weapons from hidden compartments, and they seized the guards before they could react. The Shitra spread the word instantly through their mental network, and within seconds, every slave on the planet knew that the uprising had started. The Morvalans flooded the Vel'Korath command centers by reversing the flow of the cooling systems. Kronith simply walked through the walls of the armory and handed weapons to anyone who could hold them. The planetary defense grid fell into rebel hands within 2 hours, and Elena broadcast her own message to the stars. Keth Prime is free. Who will join us? On the Dominion homeworld, Dmitry Volkov received a signal, and he smiled for the first time in 15 years. He had spent all those years building an army that the Vel'Korath thought was just a labor force. His workers had manufactured weapons in secret and hidden them throughout the planet they had trained. In the darkness of the mines and the heat of the factories, they had waited and planned and dreamed of this night now. Their dreams were becoming reality. Dmitry gave the order, and 10,000 human workers became 10,000 soldiers in an instant. Struck at military bases and government buildings and communication centers, they freed prisoners from Vel'Korath jails, and they armed them and sent them to join the fight. The Vel'Korath security forces tried to respond, but they were overwhelmed by the speed and coordination of the attack. They had never faced an enemy that moved so fast and struck from so many directions at once. Commander Sithrek was in his quarters when the first reports reached him, and at first he did not believe what he was hearing. 17 simultaneous rebellions across the Empire. That was impossible. No slave uprising had ever spread beyond a single world before. But as the hours passed, the number kept growing. 30 rebellions, 50 rebellions, 93 rebellions. By the end of the first day, Sithrak realized with horror that this was not a random outbreak of violence. This was a coordinated attack that had been planned for years. Someone had connected the scattered slave populations across the entire Dominion. Someone had taught them how to fight together. Someone had given them hope, and he knew in his heart who that someone must be. The humans. The Firans, that they be humans, the Duminos. Same species that had fought for 11 years on their homeworld. The same species that had cost him more soldiers than any other conquest. The same species that he had warned the Council about all those years ago. They had been waiting in the shadows, learning, planning, building an army out of broken slaves and forgotten prisoners. And now they had struck at the heart of an empire that had ruled for 10,000 years. Thrak gathered his remaining forces and he prepared for war. But deep inside he felt something cold growing in his chest. It was the same feeling he had experienced standing in the ruins of human cities on Earth. It was fear. The Velkhoreth had believed that conquering a planet meant breaking its people. They had believed that slaves could never rise against their masters. They had believed that their empire would last forever, but they had forgotten the most important lesson that humanity had to teach. Freedom is not a gift that can be given or taken away. It is a fire that burns inside every living being, and once that fire is lit, it can never be put out. The spark had been struck. The galaxy was burning, and the Velkhoreth Dominion would never be the same again. The crumbling throne. 6 months had passed since the night the galaxy caught fire, and the Velkhoreth Dominion was bleeding from 1,000 wounds. High Commander Sithrak stood in the war room of the Imperial Palace, and he stared at the holographic map that showed the state of the empires. So many worlds glowed red with rebellion that the map looked like it was covered in blood. He had fought wars his entire life, but he had never experienced anything like this. Previous slave uprisings had been small and isolated and easy to crush. The rebels would seize a city or a factory, and the Velkhoreth would send in troops, and the fighting would end within days. But this rebellion was different. It was everywhere at once, and it seemed to have no center that could be destroyed. Every time Sithrak thought he had identified the leaders of the uprising, they would disappear, and new leaders would take their place. Every time he crushed a rebellion on one world, 2 more would erupt on other worlds, and everywhere he looked, he found humans. They were not the largest group among the rebels, and they were not the strongest, but they were the ones who held everything together. They planned the attacks, and they trained the fighters, and they inspired the other species to keep going when all hope seemed lost. Sithrak had studied human history obsessively since the uprising began, because he needed to understand how they thought. He read about their ancient wars and their revolutions and their endless struggles for freedom. He learned about places called Thermopylae and Masada and Stalingrad, where small groups of humans had fought against impossible odds and had refused to surrender even when defeat was certain. He learned about leaders called Spartacus and Washington and Gandhi, who had inspired millions to rise against their oppressors, and he learned something that chilled him to his core. Humans did not fight like other species. Other species fought to win, and when winning became impossible, they surrendered to survive. But humans fought for something beyond victory. They fought for ideas and principles and dreams that they valued more than their own lives. They would rather die free than live as slaves, and that made them the most dangerous enemy the Velkhoreth had ever faced. The other enslaved species were learning from the humans, and that was what frightened Sithrak the most. The Chitra had become the nervous system of the rebellion. Their shared mind allowed them to communicate instantly across light years, and no Velkhoreth encryption could break their mental network. They knew everything that happened everywhere, and they shared that knowledge with all the rebel forces in real time. Morvalans had become masters of sabotage. They controlled the water and cooling systems that kept Velkhoreth cities functioning, and they could bring an entire planet to its knees simply by turning off the flow. They flooded military bases and drained reservoirs and poisoned supplies with chemicals that only affected Velkhoreth biology. The Kroneth had become an unstoppable army. They were nearly impossible to kill, and they felt no pain, and they never retreated. They would walk into enemy fire and keep walking until they reached their targets, and nothing short of complete destruction could stop them. Before the rebellion, the Kroneth had been peaceful and slow to anger. But the humans had taught them that sometimes anger is necessary. Sometimes you have to fight, and once the Kroneth decided to fight, they did not stop until the fight was over. Sithrak sent his best generals to crush the rebellion, but they kept failing. General Vreth took a fleet of 50 warships to retake Keth Prime, and he found his ships surrounded by vessels that had been stolen from Velkhoreth shipyards and crewed by former slaves. who had learned to fly them. Half his fleet was destroyed before he could retreat. General Morgan landed an army of 100,000 soldiers on a mining world, and they were swallowed by tunnels that the rebels had spent months preparing. The Valkara soldiers marched in, and they never marched out. General Scylla tried to negotiate a surrender with the rebel leaders on a space station, and she was captured when the station's life support was taken over by Morvellan technicians. The rebels broadcast her confession of Valkarath war crimes across the entire galaxy. Steph realized that he was not fighting a war, he was fighting an idea, and you cannot kill an idea with soldiers and ships. The more the Valkarath fought, the more species joined the rebellion worlds that had been loyal to the Dominion for thousands of years. Suddenly declared independence officers who had served the Empire their entire lives defected to the rebel side because they could see which way the wind was blowing. Even some Valkarath citizens began to question whether their empire deserved to serve. Surfric requested a meeting with the Imperial Council, and he told them the truth that no one wanted to hear. "We are losing this war," he said. "We cannot defeat an enemy that is everywhere, and nor we cannot crush a rebellion that feeds on our cruelty. Every atrocity we commit creates 10 new rebels. Every world we burn inspires 20 more to rise against us." The council demanded a solution, but Sithrak had none to offer. He told them that the only way to end the rebellion was to give the slaves what they wanted: freedom. The council refused. They would rather watch their empire burn than admit that they had been wrong, and so the war continued. Cities fell and fleets were destroyed, and millions died on both sides. The throne of the Valkarath Dominion had stood for 10,000 years. Now it was crumbling, and at the center of it all were the humans, small and fragile and short-lived, but burning with a fire that could not be extinguished. They had lost their world, but they had gained something greater. They had become the spark that set the galaxy ablaze, and the Valkarath finally understood the warning that Sithrak had given them all those years ago. They had not conquered Earth, they had unleashed it. The new dawn. 2 years after the rebellion began, Elena Vasquez walked through the shattered gates of the Imperial Palace on Vulcar Prime, and she felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. The palace had stood for 10,000 years as a symbol of Valkarath power and dominance. Emperors had ruled the galaxy from these halls, and they had believed that their dynasty would last forever. Now the halls were empty, and the throne room was filled with rubble, and the last emperor had fled into the darkness of space with whatever loyal forces he had left. The war was not completely over. Pockets of Valkarath resistance still held a handful of systems at the edges of what had once been their empire. There would be more fighting before true peace could be achieved, but the Dominion as it had existed for millennia was broken beyond repair. Elena stood in the center of the throne room, and she looked around at the representatives who had gathered to witness this moment. 37 species had sent delegates to stand in this place where their ancestors had once knelt as conquered slaves. The Chitra clicked their mandibles in a sound that meant joy and relief. The Morvallans wept tears that evaporated in the dry air of this world that was so different from their ocean homes. Cronoth stood like ancient statues, and their stone faces showed no emotion, but Elena knew that they felt this victory as deeply as anyone. And everywhere she looked, she saw humans. They had paid a terrible price for this moment. Millions had died in the fighting on Earth, and millions more had died in the rebellion. Entire generations had grown up knowing nothing but war and slavery and death, but they had also grown up knowing that freedom was worth fighting for. That was what made humans different from the species that had submitted to the Valkarath. That was what made them dangerous and beautiful and impossible to defeat. Marcus Chun stood beside Elena, and he looked older than his years. His hands still bore the scars from his time in the shipyards, and his eyes held shadows that would never completely fade. But Ed, he was smiling because they had done the impossible. Dmitry Volkov stood on her other side, and his massive frame seemed Smaller somehow now that the fighting was done. He had lost so many friends in this war that he had stopped counting. But he had also gained something that he thought he had lost forever on Earth. He had gained HFY, representative from the newly formed Galactic Assembly stepped forward, and she spoke in a voice that trembled with emotion. The Assembly offers humanity a position of honor. She said, "You led this rebellion and you taught us all how to fight for freedom. We want you to lead the military forces that will protect our new union. We want you to be our sword and our shield against any who would try to enslave use again." Elena looked at Marcus and Dimitri, and then she looked at the humans scattered throughout the crowd they had discussed this moment many times during the long years of planning and fighting. They had known that if they won, they would be offered power, and they had decided long ago what their answer would be. Elena turned back to the Assembly representative, and she shook her head. "We did not fight this war to become the next empire," she said. "We did not sacrifice millions of lives so that humans could rule over other species. We fought because we believe that every thinking being in this galaxy has the right to be free. We fought because we have seen what happens when one species decides that it is better than all the others. And we will not become what we destroyed." The throne room fell silent as the other species processed her words. They had expected humanity to claim the prize they had earned. They had expected the humans to become the new masters of the galaxy. But instead, the humans were walking away from power. Elena continued speaking, and her voice carried to every corner of the room. "Govern yourselves," she said. "Build your own societies and make your own choices and learn from your own mistakes. Protect each other and respect each other, and never forget what it felt like to be in chains. Create something better than the Dominion ever was. Create a galaxy where no child is born a slave. And if anyone ever tries to take your freedom away again." She paused, and she smiled the same smile that had terrified Valkyrith soldiers in the tunnels of Earth. "Kala," she said, in the weeks that followed, the Galactic Assembly drafted a charter that would govern the new Union of Free Worlds. The first article was written in every known language, and it was displayed on monuments across the galaxy. "All sentient beings are born free." It was simple, and it was powerful, and it said everything that needed to be said. Humanity did not take a leadership role in the new government. Instead, they returned to their wounded homeworld, and they began the long process of healing. Earth had been scarred by the invasion and the years of occupation, but it was still beautiful. Forests grew over old battlefields, and children played in streets that had once been filled with blood. Survivors told stories to the younger generations about the war and the rebellion and the victory that had seemed impossible. They told them about Elena and Marcus and Dimitri and all the others who had refused to give up. They told them about the Chitra and the Morvalans and the Kronoth and all the species that had found courage when humanity showed them what courage looked like. And they told them the most important lesson of all: freedom is not something that is given, it is something that is taken. It is something that must be fought for and protected and passed down from generation to generation. The Valkyrith had believed that they could conquer humanity by conquering Earth. They had been wrong. They had spread humans across the galaxy like seeds, and those seeds had grown into a forest fire that consumed their empire. They had tried to break the human spirit, and instead they had set it free. Now the galaxy was different. It was messy and complicated, and there were still problems that would take centuries to solve, but it was free, and that was enough. Elena Vasquez spent her final years on Earth in a small house near the mountains where she had grown up. She watched the sun set over forests that her grandchildren played in, and she felt at peace. She had done what she set out to do all those years ago when she was a young fighter. Hiding in tunnels beneath her homeland, she had proven that no chain is unbreakable. She had proven that no empire is eternal, and she had proven that humanity would rather burn than bow. Invasion of Earth had been meant to be the end of human independence. Instead, it had become the beginning of something far greater, a new dawn for the galaxy, and a reminder to anyone who might try to conquer humanity again: we do not kneel. We do not surrender. We do not forget, and we never stop fighting for freedom.